I'm going to sit down shortly, but I want to also just give you my welcome. My name is Maria Cimperman. I'm a religious of the Sacred Heart of Jesus and have the privilege of both serving on the faculty of theological ethics here at Catholic Theological Union and also serving as the first director of our Center for the Study of Consecrated Life. And one of the early areas we took on was the question of religious priesthood. What does it mean? What's the identity? What are the questions? What are the tensions? And how do we move forward in the conversation that has gone on at different moments and with different emphases? And so if you happen to be here in April of 2017, was anyone at the conference from April? So there's a handful that were here for a conference that was convened, and it was on this very topic. From there came the book, Priesthood in Religious Life, Searching for New Ways Forward. And it was a delightful conference. It was a packed day and a packed audience, a packed 2 days. And people from all over the United States and all areas of both initial formation to provincials and general superiors and archbishops were here to look at what are we trying to engage, what is the Spirit moving, how shall we theologically talk about priesthood when priesthood is connected to religious life. So from this book, we are blessed that 5 of our authors, we have 6 faculty authors, 5 were able to be here, 1 is teaching right now, Father Leslie Happy. But 5 of the authors were able to be here to have a conversation first on, well, what insights did you gain as you were preparing the presentation you did in 2017 and then the manuscript in 2018. And then the second question we'll look at is, so what new questions, what new thoughts do you have? What's come forth? Because as we all know, each day brings new insights and opportunities. And so this is the opportunity we have now. And really your coming together for this brings us to yet the next layer and to say, so what questions do you have? So about half of the time will be spent in conversation with the panelists, and then the other half will be with you. So thank you very much for coming. I'm going to introduce our authors. We're really blessed that we can have this conversation. And I want to introduce first Father Steve Bevans. Steve Bevans is a priest of the Society of the Divine Word, and it was your idea to really bring this forth because of what you were listening to. So I'm looking forward to hearing more from you on that. To his left is Father Dan Horan, a Franciscan, who looked at the question of spirituality and the priesthood and what's beckoning, what's asking, and how is that distinctive? And to his left is Father vănThanh Nguyễn, who's also an SVD priest and was looking at what are the, how does someone from an Asian context offer an insight into what religious priesthood might be? What are the wisdoms that come forth from our different cultures? So look forward to that conversation as well. To my right is Father Eddie de León, a Claretian, who looked at the question of what's the distinction that you come at from your context if it would be a Latinx one, and what are the questions about resistance? What are the questions about creativity that come forth? So I'm so glad you are here with us as well, Eddie. And then Father Robin Ryan is the co-editor of this book along with Steve Bevans, and Robin is a Passionist and really looked at the question of, well, if Pope Francis were engaging us today, what might he offer? What insights do we gain from this? So the question, my brothers, is to ask you, now, what new insights came forth for you as you were writing this, engaging this? What new? Because each one of you created something very new for this presentation. and then the paper that went. And they could have been two different sets of insights as well. So, Robin, would you begin?
Well, I've been interested in Pope Francis all along. My students know this. They hear about Pope Francis all the time, whether they like it or not. You know, in writing this and researching this, of course, Pope Francis is a religious priest, so that's a good start. And I really found out that there are so many good connections between, you know, Pope Francis hasn't written a book on priesthood that I know of. You sort of have to glean his theology of priesthood and of pastoral ministry from different talks he's given, sometimes to mixed audiences, sometimes to audiences of consecrated folks and diocesan priests. So you have to glean it from there. But there are so many connections between his understanding of priestly ministry and of ministry in general and our understanding of religious life. Yesterday, a book arrived at my house, at our house, by Austin Ivory, who wrote one of the biographies of Francis called The Great Reformer, and has written a new book called Wounded Shepherd, Pope Francis and His Struggle to Convert the Catholic Church. I started on chapter 10, which is the last chapter, because the title is Mercy and Its Discontents. And in my article, in my chapter, and my talks on Francis, I always put mercy first as the first ingredient, the primacy of mercy. And Pope Francis has paid a price for emphasizing that, much criticism, some of it very fierce and hostile. But I think Francis's own priesthood, as he lives that as the Pope, stresses, you know, brings to the fore for us the impact of charism, how each of us lives our charism in our own way, but how charism is meant to animate all that we do, whether we're priests or women religious or men religious brothers, and also certainly to animate our priestly ministry. And the other ingredient, of course, is community, and how living in an interdependent way. Yesterday, Diane Brigant was talking about interdependence in terms of ecology, and I think religious life is meant to really form us in that sense of interdependence that leads to a ministry that involves collaboration with others and working together as a team.
Move to Steve, because you and Robin wrote together the introduction and really set a context for both the conversation and the presentations that went with it. So how did this come about? What were you thinking about? And how did you choose to move it the way you did?
Well, when Robin and I were writing the draft of the introduction to the book, we wanted not to so much say, this chapter says this chapter says this chapter says this, which so many introductions do, and it's just kind of boring. But we wanted to do a kind of an essay, kind of surveying the field, and incorporating the various insights that the speakers, the contributors made to the conference. And one of the things, this was actually, as I was thinking about the conference and organizing it, I hit upon this phrase, which is the title really of our introduction, that it's religious priesthood, or priesthood in religious life, which is the way I prefer to say it, is a priesthood that is shaped by religious life. I think that's really an important phrase, that it's religious life that shapes priesthood, not priesthood that determines the way we live our religious life. It might be subtle, but I think it's really very, very important. And the other thing that Robin and I hit upon, and I kind of sketched out the introduction, and then Robin and I talked about it and so forth. But it's the idea that let's not think of priesthood in religious life as so much unique, like we're really different from these diocesan guys, you know, this kind of thing. But rather, it's not uniqueness, it's faithfulness. And so our priesthood in religious life is shaped by our faithfulness. And a couple of months after the book came out, Robin and I were given a copy of this wonderful Boston College paper on priesthood, which, if you don't know it, it's really a marvelous thing. And we said, why don't we write, because it was focused on diocesan priests, and we said, why don't we write something about priesthood in religious life? And we came up with 4 things that you could say distinguish religious life, priesthood in religious life. Robin has talked about 2 of them: community and then charism. We also talked about the prophetic aspect from the vows and other aspects of religious life, and then the global dimension, that so many of us are in communities that are not just focused on, you know, one place or one country. And I think that one of the keys to understanding priesthood in religious life is a fidelity to these. It's not that diocesan priests don't have these things, but that we, as religious, need to be faithful to these things, faithful to our community in all the ways that could happen. I could talk a lot about that. Faithful to our charism. Our particular charism, missionary charism, preaching charism, whatever it might be. Faithful to the global and intercultural dimension, and faithful to the prophetic dimension, to take risks and not just be part of an institution. So I think if we're faithful to this, you know, we may, you know, overlap with diocesan priests, but it's something I think can really distinguish us in this way.
It seems a natural then to ask you, Dan, because the sense of spirituality undergirding the life, the religious life, but also you ended up writing quite a bit on the prophetic dimensions, the courageous elements of religious life and priesthood. And so could you talk a little bit more about that and maybe what insights you gained from your work in preparing for this?
Sure, thank you. And I think you're right, it does follow nicely after what Steve was just saying, and I was thinking back to Mark's introduction as well, Father Mark's introduction, where he made a comment about the program for priestly formation has nothing to say basically about formation for ministerial priesthood in the religious context. That's commonplace throughout the magisterial teaching that we have. And so if you go to the Second Vatican Council's document on ministerial priesthood, Presbyterum Ordinis, in the very opening paragraph, there's one dependent clause after a comma that says, and suitable adaptations should be made for religious, period, and then goes on to presuppose that ministerial priesthood is always and only within the context of secular or diocesan context, and more to the point, in parochial or parish contexts. And so to that end as well, whenever religious life has been introduced in conversations at the universal church level with regard to ministerial priesthood, as was the case after in the early 1990s, there was a Synod of Bishops on priesthood, and Pope John Paul II's post-synodal exhortation names in passing religious communities, but does so in such a way that recognizes us as sort of the kind of spice you add or the salt or pepper you add after you have already baked the ministerial priesthood. So that, and again, a very diocesan sort of mentality, which is understandable given, as Robin mentioned a moment ago, the difference in formation, for example, from Pope Francis as a Jesuit and John Paul II as a diocesan priest. And so the presentation has been, by and large, that religious life is an afterthought, indeed a gift to the church, but one of kind of an add-on. So you are a ministerial priest and you kind of outsource your spirituality to your Carmelite charism or to your Passionist charism or to the charism of the Franciscan tradition and so forth. And so the task that was placed before me in this particular project is to think about, is there something that grounds a spirituality of ministerial priesthood in the context of religious life that is kind of trans-obediential, that moves beyond the particular charisms of our religious congregations, societies, orders, and so forth, many of which, so it's not to demean those, but I acknowledge in the first place that is the heart, as both Robin and Steve have already said, and I really appreciate this idea that it's our religious life that shapes the exercise of ministerial priesthood or the presbyteral ministry, not the other way around, and that is very important. But is there something we can say in terms of a starting point for thinking about the lived reality of our spiritual lives as people who share a kind of vocation within a vocation, of a call to ministerial priesthood, while at the same time being faithful, to pick up on that term, to our primary vocations in religious life, whatever charism that may be. And so, as you said, Maria, the starting point for me is really the same starting point that we see theologically, which is not that, as Steve rightly said, there are two priesthoods. The Jesuit historian John O'Malley has made that point time and again over the decades, that there's one priesthood with perhaps two expressions, two emphases. And for those of us in religious communities, the emphasis is not primarily, the starting point is not perhaps the sanctifying office that we share through baptism and then expressed in a particular way through holy orders, but that our starting point might be the prophetic office of Christ. And so what does that look like in terms of affecting our spirituality? And it's from there that I say we can be faithful to our respective charismatic traditions, but one thing that we share in common is that prophetic faithfulness, expressed in a variety of ways. And maybe we'll have time. I don't want to say too much more about that now. But basically the claim is, what I learned, the takeaway is that though we have different histories, different founders, different spiritual traditions, what we share in common perhaps is our starting point in understanding the exercise of the one ministerial priesthood, the one order of presbyters, but within a religious context.
And in offering that context, the distinction with religious in the area of priesthood, vănThanh, your essay offered a beautiful lens of looking at both the image, you gave us an image of bamboo, but also talking about the Asian, one set of Asian contexts with the triple dialogues. And I'm wondering if you could talk more about the insights that came to you as you were preparing this and how those flow.
Thank you. The experience was, for me, a wonderful experience personally, as I looked at what it means for me to be a religious priest. And I've discovered much about myself, really, exploring, looking at how I've been formed and how I've been administered as a priest in the Asian context, and the gifts that I and other Asian priests bring to the communities we live and the church we work and serve. One of the things I discover that as Asian priests really it's a great gift that we bring to the church in this day and age, and particularly in many places I've seen. I just came back from Taiwan, for example, seeing the church over there, how many priests from Vietnam and religious are working in Taiwan, ministering to the church there. It's amazing. There are hundreds of Vietnamese priests working there in the church. The gifts that we bring is certainly, I see Asian priests are dedicated, very really sacrifice their life for the ministry of the word and the church. And yet there is also the challenges of being an Asian priest. And I discover that while it is a gift we bring, the people do respect us of who we are and our dedication. And sometimes their high respect can elevate us to a kind of a status that can lead us to to perceive ourselves as super religious in comparison to what Paul says, the super apostles, you know. And then so we get a wrong image of who we gradually become and which we were formed. And so we tend to be a little bit uncompromising as we go about in our ministry and service because of what others have elevated us to the point of where we should not be. And so in reflecting on this and how the challenges that we face when we minister to our own Asian people, that can lead to a little more hierarchical and clerical state of who we are meant to be. And so I look at the symbol, I explore what are the symbols that can help us see what our religious priesthood look like and how that we can offer the church and move into a better sense of what it means to be Asians in the religious context. And the bamboo kind of came to mind, and I thought that the bamboo image is an important image that for all of us as we examine who we are. A simple tree that has great strength and power in its simplicity and flexibility. The bamboo is a good image of an Asian priest who, can sway and bend but don't break kind of spirituality. So the bamboo image, it was a really fun experience for me to look at that, how the bamboo can teach us a lot in its simplicity, strength, and flexibility. Those are three values that I think Asian religious priests can offer to this dialogue. As I look forward, I was thinking about the question, what more if I were to do and develop on this? The other image that comes to mind is the lotus. A symbol of the lotus is very familiar in Asian context. You see it everywhere. You see it as a symbol. This lotus they grow in dirty, mucky water, and springs out of this comes life and beauty. Sometimes, it's amazing as you see the lotus pond. It's amazing flower and color, but it's really comes out from the depth and mucky water, and therefore is a symbol of rebirth, awakening, and that I think is a good symbol for us today. You can see life out of this almost impossibility, and yet come forth and can bring really beauty and strength and in the midst of adversity. So that symbol, the new symbol for me, another symbol beyond the bamboo, is the lotus flower, which fits in Buddhism and Hinduism as a symbol of rebirth, symbol of life and rekindling and incredible beauty in the midst of great adversity, and that we can, even in adversity of religious life, as we can overcome anything if we put our resource and our strength into becoming a better religious for the church today.
It's such a reminder that our context, of course, we know that at CDU, our context make so much difference. And Eddie, you brought a set of contexts into this conversation as well, and you also moved us to the edges and where priesthood is called, but in particular religious priesthood, and you did it from your particular perspective. Could you say a little about what insights came to you as you were thinking about that and engaging?
Thank you. Well, I thought of things that came to mind were words like la lucha, resistance, the fight, privilege, white privilege. And then as I'm reflecting on this, I'm also thinking of the history of pain that the Latino community have suffered throughout our history here in the United States. And there have been many religious orders, Claretian missionaries are one of them, in the early 1900s, who come primarily for Latino communities and ministries. And so I thought of that, of La Lucha, and I wondered, where is La Lucha today? Where is resistance today? Where is the prophetic today? And I thought of people like Bartolomé de las Casas. I thought of non-priests like Sor Juan Inés de la Cruz. I thought of Patricio Flores, the first Archbishop, Latino bishop here. and how Patricio Flores would send me $100 a month he would say, for books or school supplies while I was a student at Loyola. And I think of those parts of our history, and the painful parts are the Latino community relegated to the basement. If they could have Mass in the Catholic Church, they were relegated to the basement. And while the upstairs church were having a 15-minute homily, we were only permitted 5 minutes for a homily. Yeah? As a preacher, that's a little bit, okay, for a Sunday. And you look at some of that conflict and some of that pain, and then how it continued on. And people who assisted, but then my question was always, where are the Latino priests? Where are the Latino religious? And I remember when we would see the first Latina sister, the first Latino priest, we would always welcome them in our home and everything because we had never seen one before. And just the pride in that. It's really, with this culture, it's really about the privilege that some have, and even today how it perpetuates in the system that we're all part of and we all contribute to, but how the resistance is still needed. The voices of prophecy are still needed. La lucha still continues. At one time we had los padres and las madres, religious sisters and priests. And if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't have had Patricio Flores, because it was of their voice and they're fighting for it that they got it all the way to the Vatican, who then said, well, who is this Patrick Flores? And when they met with him, they said in private, after he left, we don't expect much, but we trust they'll be happy. Meaning us, Latinos, that we would be happy. And they didn't expect much from Patricio Flores. And I think that it still continues. It continues in the work that I do with the deacons, the Spanish-speaking deacons, and how many of them joke how they're giving theology light because they can't capture, they couldn't grasp the whole of theology, so they're giving it light. And then I see these deacons, when I teach them preaching, I see them that after weeks they become more confident, and more confident. And it's because it's a Latino to a Latino saying, you can do this. And they look at me and they say, well, if he's done it, he knows what he's saying. And the wives thanking me for having brought their husbands at a level of confidence that they could serve the church, the universal church. But I think that that's why I wrote on this prophetic, because there's a cost. And there's always a cost. You know, it's never that easy. And it's not cheaply paid off. It costs something. And so when you look at the history that the Latino community have had here, that's why I put Latinx narratives, because that word is even a word of resistance, that we claim it, and that's our word. You know, many people, as you remember, use the word Hispanic, and some still use Hispanic ministry. Sometimes we use the collective Latinoa. And so now you see more and more Latinx, which is that language that we began to create, a language that is able to articulate our given reality. And so then you have issues of border, and you have issues of family, and yet you've got this growing demographics in the United States of Latino people. The deacons are one of the most fastest growing ordained group of men in the church in the United States today. The largest and the fastest growing. And so we're giving them theology light because they couldn't grasp it. They're blue collar. They wouldn't be able to grasp all this. And I said to our team, maybe it's the pedagogy we're using that's not an effective pedagogy. Maybe we need to re-examine our methodology, our pedagogy that we use, because they know we have to draw from them. And that's when they have these moments that, I know this, I didn't know I knew this. But we do that here at CTU. That you come and he says, I didn't know I had this. I didn't know I was good at this. And so I think for me, that chapter in this book was important that I would articulate it, and no one else, a non-Latino, would articulate that, but that a Latino himself would articulate it on behalf of a people who have struggled and have had a sense of celebration And that's why that image of Guadalupe is always, and every year it seems to, for me, continue to be a strong, powerful image with Mary. And when Virgilio Elizondo, when I was at Yale in chaplaincy, Virgilio Elizondo came to preach. And Virgilio Elizondo and I were sitting with a bottle of wine and dinner. And Virgilio said to me, Eddie, what do you think of Guadalupe? And I said, I think it's a powerful image. I think it's a powerful image. He says, yes, but do you know that she's in La Lucha? Do you know that she's resisting? See, her knee is bent, and there's a fold in her dress. He said, she is doing the indigenous dance, that in the midst of everything that's going on, the injustices, the chaos, the uncertainty, she's doing the indigenous dance because ultimately God has the last word. And so she rejoices in that. And so I think that it's people like that who, Virgilio who's gone, others who have long gone, that new voices have to emerge and represent them and speak on, join other voices in articulating this given reality. Because as much as we like to think, we used to say, well, racism is long gone. We dealt with that in the 60s. It's long gone. And unfortunately, this December I'm going to the Academy of Homiletics. That's not the unfortunate piece. I love going there. But at the Academy of Homiletics, we're addressing preaching and racism. And so it tells us that it's topical, it's necessary if we're all to grow, because we're all in this together.
You've all brought in such key elements and elements that are continuing to ask us questions and demand responses from us. I'm wondering if, just for a few minutes in any direction, what are the questions that are coming forth for you today? 2 years almost beyond the conference and a year beyond the book coming out. What's new? What's engaging? What are the questions that you're thinking about and you're hearing? And then we'll invite you to engage us as well. But a few minutes, what's coming forth for you?
The recent synod has brought forth questions for us. Certainly the role of women in ordained ministry, with the openness to restudy the diaconate question, the question of providing Eucharist for people in marginalized areas and remote regions, and also the further more important question of women in authority in the church and having a voice. As I understand it, no women voted at the synod. So all of those questions, I think you have to ask them as a religious priest and wonder where we're going with that.
So my answer to that question is everything. You know, one of the things, and it's not just because I contributed to this volume, and it's not just because Robin and Steve are here, or you were here, Maria, but you know, this is the first volume of any kind of thinking on priesthood and religious life in English in a long time, you know, almost at least 20 years, yeah. And as students who have had the theology and spirituality of religious priesthood with me know, you know, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. And so for me, you know, I appreciate Robin's questions. They're very, very important, but there are, because there just hasn't been sustained thought about this relationship. And I think Steve named it well by way of contrast, that so often, because the Church Universal defaults to an understanding of the order of presbyters and the ministerial priesthood to be a secular ministerial priesthood, by which I mean a diocesan ministerial priesthood, far too often we default to a parochial model of being kind of diocesan priests with initials after our names. At least that's the way the church treats us and views us. And so, a shout out to another initiative here at CTU that's being directed by our colleague Marian Diaz, the Thriving in Ministry grant program that we have. We are going to continue this work over the next couple of years and bring together scholars and professors who are forming and teaching and researching in this area to continue to ask the questions, you know, how does the fact that there is this very important reality of ministerial priesthood expressed within the context of religious life that has received relatively little attention. How do things like the question of women's leadership, women's authority in the church, the voices of various contexts that have been, as Eddie rightly said, been subjugated or overlooked as a result of racism and privilege, hierarchical clerical privilege, racial white privilege, gender male privilege, all these intersecting factors I think are worthy of exploration. But that's a long-winded way of saying everything that I think we just haven't sufficiently asked enough of the questions. And to me, what's really exciting about this book is in the conference out of which it arises and the work of the center is, we're beginning to really ask these questions. One last thing just comes to mind in response to that is, the Boston College working document is fantastic. It's really great, but like my brother colleagues here, we were kind of disappointed to see that again. It's a reiteration of the program of priestly formation or presbyterum ordinis, where it's just a quick acknowledgement that there is such a thing as ministerial priests in religious life, and so the can gets kicked down the road some more. Well, I think we've grabbed the can and we're going to try to open it up a little bit.
An interesting question as I look at the changing face of Christianity, particularly the movement of the Christianity moving to the global south and the shift due to migration as well. Many Christianity is growing in the East and in Latin America and in Africa in particular, and how that is reshaping the church in general. Religious priests are making an impact in probably all the dioceses in Asia and even here in the U.S. For example, I went to Mongolia several years ago, and the church there is basically ministered by religious priests from various religious orders. In Taiwan, I just came back yesterday, I see that the diocesan church is very small, and therefore the churches, the parishes are served by religious priests all over the world. There's also a change of the face of Christianity here, where many churches, parishes, are served by priests from other parts, international priests from other parts of the world. So many are Asians. And how that effect is changing the church in many ways. Gifts as also challenges. One of the challenges is that oftentimes religious forget who they are, meant to be religious, and therefore replacing diocesan priests in diocesan setting, and we tend to begin to lose their identity, their real identity as religious, and so becoming more clerical, more diocesan than religious, and that sense of danger, I think, for many, particularly Asians serving in parish setting, when the people respect the priests, elevate the priests to a different level, and then we tend to live on that, and then people forget who we are. And that those symbols of, therefore the symbol of bamboo is important, simplicity, dedication, service, and particularly the symbol of the lotus, that remain pure in the midst of, this dirty pond, murky water, and essentially remaining pure can lead to great gift and beauty. And so I think the challenge for religious continue to be is that how do we remain faithful to our calling, our vocation as religious, while we serve in the diocesan parishes?
And I think that when we serve in diocesan parishes or other pastoral ministry sites, that people notice a difference most often with a diocesan and a religious order. They always say you're different. And then they mean that we're different in this, perhaps in the style of collaboration. That we collaborate, we ask for input, we allow and we accompany in rising up and educating leadership in the church. And so I think people see that distinctly different. I remember being a student here, and I always joke with Steve Bevans, but Steve Bevans was instrumental in my own formation because he was my spiritual director here. And we always joke about it because he said, look where you've been now. Yeah, I know. But it was with that. But what he did is, I don't remember any of the answers he gave me for any of the questions I posed. But what I remember is that he was there. That he accompanied me in my formation, in my educating, that he was consistently there, and that he offered advice. He led me through some things, but I don't remember what those were. I just remember he was present, and I think a big thing is for us to be present. That presence is far more important than anything. It is that accompanying, that being with. And for me, it impacted me so. That's what I desire. That whether it's other priests or it's women religious or women in the church, you know, I tell the deacons' wives or the deacon candidates' wives, I say to them, you have received the same education, right? The same education, Father. We've been here for the last 4 years. We've gone through all the classes and everything. And I said, what would happen if Pope Francis allows deaconess? You're all prepared, right? You've all done the preaching and everything. And they says, yeah, we're ready. And I noticed that there are priests, mainly religious sort of priests, who already start asking women who have been through the deacon programs to start taking leadership roles in the parishes. And I say to them in class, we just ended class 2 weeks ago, I say, you're prepared. You're ready for these things, you know? This is this group I'm working with. This is their last group prior to ordination in May. So I think that, I know that the two important things for me has been the accompaniment and the collaboration in the church.
Strikes me, you ask, you know, what are the new questions, and I, for me, one of the frustrating things is that the persistence of the old questions. I mean, I think, you know, we've hit upon this. I mean, I just think, you know, like in my experience in my own community, ordination still, pardon the expression, trumps you know, the perpetual profession. It just does. You bring in a bishop and, you know, there's more people there, there's more excitement about it and so forth. I wonder sometimes, wouldn't it be nice if we had a rite of ordination for religious, you know, because the rite for ordination is exactly the same for both kinds of priests. I don't know how that would happen. Maybe our liturgists can work on that kind of thing. But I think that would be a wonderful way, you know, I don't know how we do it, distinguish. But why would we have to, for instance, make a pledge of obedience to a bishop? You know, why can't it be more? I mean, I know it's included in there, but you know, could we have maybe a little bit more charism and prophetic stuff and all? I think it would be a kind of an interesting thing. So it's frustrating for me, the persistence of the old forms, and I wish we could have, you know, some creative, bold, maybe risky, prophetic thinking about how we might even celebrate the ordination of a priest in religious life.
If I could just follow that, that was exactly what I was thinking. Both the liturgical tensions and the juridical tensions that remain unaddressed by the universal church. And this centers around things like authority and exemption. This is especially true of male religious communities as we're thinking about ministerial priesthood in the context of religious life. You know, our ordinaries are our provincials or generals, and yet the theology of ministerial priesthood is participation in the fullness of orders of the local bishop. Don't get me started on titular bishops. That's a whole other thing together. But so there are tensions that are present. In fact, just this morning we had class, the theology and spirituality of religious priesthood, and this was one of the things we were talking about. Is, you know, and so I like Steve's proposal of, you know, it's worth noting too that the promise of obedience to the ordaining bishop, which is a sort of contradiction when somebody's already in solemn profession or perpetual profession to their legitimate religious superior. You can't, there's a contradiction there, there's a conflict, and instead of kind of the liturgists and And certainly those who have oversight over the particular liturgical law addressing this, we just kind of do it anyways and say, well, let's not talk about it. We just move on. So I think there are some questions there theologically about there's only one ministerial priesthood. There's only one order of presbyters, diocesan and religious, participating in that. And so how do we understand, too, the juridical conflict? So there's a lot that needs to be untangled there. If I can say one more thing, too, about the lack of emphasis, unfortunately, on the other aspects or offices of the threefold office that we receive at baptism, out of which ministerial priesthood arises. It arises out of the priesthood of the baptized, and it's ordered to the service of that same baptismal priesthood. And therefore, we've had historically, and I think this speaks to what vănThanh was talking about with diocesan parishes and ministry, that there's a disproportionate focus on the sanctifying office, such that, especially in our day where there's increasing demands and fewer number of ministerial priests, the demand is then that you become a sacramental machine. And what is priesthood all about? It's about filling these parish slots. It's about celebrating the sacraments, which is an important part of it. But we have a diminishment of then the prophetic office, and we're saying prophetic a lot, but that's really the teaching office, the office of preaching, the office of the word, which Presbyterum Ordini says is the starting point for presbyteral ministry. It's actually the word, not the sanctifying office, the teaching office. But then also we lose the leadership of the community, the governance office, that sort of stuff too. So I think a restoration of that is a real important place, not just for priests in religious life, but for our diocesan brothers as well.
Thank you for this. Clearly, there are many more questions that need to be engaged than conversations to engage. You mentioned, Dan, thriving in ministry, and I do want to say Miriam Diaz and I had a conversation about this conversation that was going to happen, and she said, I'd love to be in collaboration with this gathering and see what's also possible. And I think those are all places for further conversation with the center. I'm also keenly aware that this would be an interesting conversation if we had our brother diocesan priests here in a conversation, a follow-up. If we had some of our brother bishops here for a conversation about how do you see this and how do we engage. And also if we had our brothers and sisters who are married, single, in different ministries and ways of life to engage these questions too, because all of it is done in community. So I think you're giving us many places for further work. I'd like now to invite two of our students. We'll be going around and inviting questions. So would you take two of the microphones? We'll share, religious share, that's part of community. And one on each side perhaps. And so what questions or comments would you like to offer?